Hello chickens, welcome to an episode of Deep Chats. I am actually back with the very first Deep Chats guest I ever had, Angie Speaks, who is just my wondrous anarchist, leftist, card-slinging, mystical witch. And I'm so happy you're back, babe. Thank you very much for being here again.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a really great time last time you had me on, so I was so stoked to come back. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, darling. And last time we talked about, well, I mean, first of all, let me come in by saying that the reason we talked about spirituality and politics and the overlap between the two is because that's sort of where you live. So you do commentary on leftist politics, but also commentary on like the occult and mysticism, and actually where those two things overlap, and also all kinds of different stuff to do with culture and history. So it seemed like a natural thing at the time for me to talk to you about. The way I fell in love with your work was through the video that you did about fascism and its connection to the occult, and then I was hooked. It seemed natural to talk to you about spirituality, politics, are they like oil and water, or why do people think they're like oil and water? And then I thought to myself, wow, this is way more relevant even than it was when we talked about it in August 2018. We should probably revisit and do a deeper dive now.
It makes sense. And it makes sense because I always say that my channel is sort of a child of your channel, because I was watching your channel for probably like 2 years before I then decided that I was going to go ahead and start mine. And I remember you made all kinds of resources to encourage people to sort of start their own platform and put their own ideas out there. And that was really what I was imbibing, that sort of gave me the confidence to then go out and like do it myself. So like, thank you, number one. Thank you very much, number one. And yeah, it was exciting, obviously, to have someone who I've like listened to and looked up to for so long ask me to come and talk to them about my weird ideas. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, you've taken right off now. When you were on Twitter, when you were like, I should come on again, I was like, I wasn't going to ask because you're kind of a big deal now. Like,
no,
I didn't know if you'd had time.
No, I get cancelled like every other day. So never look at my metrics. Like, don't ever look at my metrics at all.
Because when I think about the other people I've had on Deep Chats, I feel like I've had it felt like they do amazing work and I love them, but I felt like we're friends, we can do this. And I feel kind of like that with you, but I felt like we met like right at the beginning of your journey, and I felt like there's a very friendly thing between us. But very quickly after that, it was like, oh my god, she's been swept off on this leftist carousel, and I was like, I don't know if we still talk like that. Do we still talk like that?
It's because I'm an Aquarius. Like, everyone always says this about me. They're always like, I don't know whether you like me or not. And I'm like, no, it's because I'm like the archetypical Queen of Swords type of person. Like, I don't know. I'm just like, I don't know. I think it's something I need to work on, like being more like approachable, because then I start to, it's just like, I think it's also built into these social media platforms. Like, we kind of have to interact with each other's brands rather than each other as people, and there's this like weird distance that's like sort of created between you and your peers because of that. And yeah, Angie Speaks is like very different from like actual like Angie, and like it's difficult to just like sort of be a person with other people when it's mediated through like Twitter and YouTube and like your quote unquote brand. It kind of overtakes the person that you are. So yeah, Kelly, anytime. I'm not like, literally I get cancelled every 2 weeks, so don't look at my metrics at all. Like, I don't even know like half of why it's even that like that anyway. So anytime you want to talk to me, like I'm open 100% to talking. So yeah, don't ever feel otherwise.
So much. That makes me really happy. And now I'm thinking, when I get back to the UK and everything's back to some semblance of normality, I must also come and hang out with you at some point.
Yes, so cool. Please, let's get a fucking drink. I don't understand why it hasn't already happened. Like, seriously.
I'm terrible. Yeah, we should. That'd be awesome. So I came in with a list of questions. I always do that for anyone who's done my Deep Chats. I send you a big list of things that I'm like, I need to pick your brain on this. And I wanted to start with something that we spoke about in our chat during August 2018, where you said, and I want to quote you, that it's flagrantly irresponsible for somebody with a platform talking about spirituality, you know, on the internet and stuff, to not express any stance on racism and white supremacy. That, you know, this idea that you can just like, that can just go under your radar, you can never touch it, you don't need to engage with the conversation, is irresponsible. And I was thinking that that has now come really to the fullness of people's minds. There are a lot of people saying that they are looking at their spiritual speakers, card slingers, etc., that they've been following, whose work they've been supporting, and they expect to see, what is your stance on BLM? What is your stance on white supremacy? And it's sort of more explicitly stated that people are unfollowing creators now, and you know, speakers and people who profess any kind of authority, really, if there isn't a stance, you know, that's actually out there. So my first question was, what would you say to those who feel it's unfair still to insist that spiritual teachers and speakers have an opinion on this and make that opinion known?
This is a really interesting question, because my politics have evolved quite a bit since our last deep chat as well. And in terms of, I think that there's like a lot of nuance to this specific issue. When talking about things like Black Lives Matter, or specifically Black issues around police brutality, around, you know, anything to do with the economic disparities that Black people face, or some of the socio-political issues that Black people face, I don't necessarily know if a lot of these spiritual teachers are qualified to have a stance beyond, this thing is bad and I disagree with it. And having a stance, a private stance like that, isn't the same as having like a public political stance on these issues. I feel like I can understand why some people would feel pressure, because it may be a thing that they don't feel qualified to speak about. There's also a lot of fear around saying the wrong thing in certain cases. There's also a lot of pressure that's put on you regardless of whatever you do. If you're somebody who's public, and you have a profile online, there's that added pressure on top of the mix. So I think it really depends. If you're, it's nice to know. I think it's a good thing. Like most people should have a moral stance on certain issues like fascism or police brutality. I think most people should have a moral stance. But one of the things about social media is it sort of acts like a panopticon, where you're forced to sort of perform that to other people. You know, there's this sort of demand for you to perform, to do a performative kind of announcement of what you do or don't believe. And, you know, you see a lot of cynicism occur because of that. There are a lot of people out there who don't actually have a stance, who don't care, who don't, or who simply are completely disengaged with any of the political conversation that's going on, but they feel the pressure to come forward and sort of perform solidarity in order to appease their following. So it becomes more about a transaction between fan and creator of validation and continued support, rather than actually addressing the social issues that are occurring. And yeah, that's kind of where I kind of side-eye this thing. I mean, there are lots of people who I follow who are, you know, movie reviewers, for instance, or because I'm really into film and TV, so I follow quite a few movie reviewers. I follow people who, you know, are in the lit world as well, like BookTube, and, you know, all of my different various interests. And some have come out to say things about Black Lives Matter and or Black issues in general, and that's great. And there are some who haven't. But then again, when I think about it, I'm like, is this really the person that I want to be hearing from on these issues? Like, what does that do other than sort of make me understand that their brand is now associated with this thing? And, you know, we're on social media, you're dealing with brands. You're dealing with the image of a person and what they've constructed. And a lot of the time, these demands that people are making are to kind of attach one's brand to anti-racism in a way that then makes their audience feel validated. But whether it actually does anything to sort of the overall issue of anti-racism, that is questionable depending on how it's done, the person, and the reasons that it's done. So there's a whole lot of nuance in that to unpick. Like, I don't believe that you should just like unfollow someone carte blanche if they haven't necessarily said anything, because there could be a myriad of reasons why they haven't said anything. I think a lot of people jump to the worst conclusions about people if they're not automatically first to respond to any sort of given issue. And some people may just not feel qualified or comfortable, or they may be afraid of saying the wrong thing. There are millions of reasons why someone may not say something during this time. But the demands to perform solidarity kind of don't sit very well with me, on especially because our interactions are mediated through social media, which has its own internal logic, and that internal logic is market logic, really. So yeah, that's kind of where I stand on that, if that makes any sense.
It does. And it makes me want to reply something and then also ask something. So I think from my perspective, I totally hear what you're saying. And I think from my perspective, I go to a very personal place because of some of the things I talk about and some of the things that I teach. So I've always been very, very vocal about shadow work. And I've built a large part of my platform on shadow work and talking about shadow work, especially at the time I started talking about it in the witchy world, is part of the reason that I can now eat off of this. So I'm sure of it, because people were just like, what is this? And this sounds really interesting. And, so I think that, and then it sort of, I wasn't the first witch by any means to talk about shadow work, but there was one other girl I could find and she was pronouncing it Carl Jung. And so I was like, okay, this is new territory here. So I really felt like, this is a new thing, and people got quite excited about it. So to me, I feel like it would be, let's say, very hypocritical to teach shadow work and talk about it as though it's only personal, and there is no such thing as the collective shadow, which I know there is, and I've read about and I've witnessed and everything else. So for me, I think it's more of a personal responsibility, and I feel like I want to see that personal responsibility extended to other people who eat off the same things I do, because otherwise I see them as being hypocritical. So it's not like I sling some cards, I've got a few hundred subs who engage with me because I have a lovely deck collection. I think I could let that person off the hook. But when I see somebody selling shadow work courses who doesn't have a stance on BLM or doesn't have a stance on white supremacy, then I feel a little bit more, not hostile necessarily, but a little bit more like, I think you need to have one though, don't you? Because let's think about what you're teaching and what you're actually going into, and what qualifies you then to talk about these things and teach these things if you won't bite that uncomfortable bullet. And the thing I suppose...
Sorry, go ahead. I was just gonna say, but we're also subject to systems, and those systems incentivize their own shadows. Like, if you look at the things that Twitter, for instance, incentivizes, it incentivizes, moral panic, high drama. It also incentivizes this sort of mob mentality around certain things. And even though racism is definitely part of the collective shadow, I feel like a lot of the ways that are being proposed right now in terms of how we fight racism also have their roots in shadow as well. Like, especially around issues of social justice, like when you get involved in issues of social justice, it makes you feel moral. It makes you feel like you're on the right side of history. It makes you feel like you are, defending the marginalized. And there are a ton of shadows underneath that sentiment that often get papered over because it's seen as supporting something that is collectively beneficial. And then there's also the extra layer of abstraction to that, which is that we are operating in a system that forces you and your stances to become a product, a brand, basically. And people want to know whether their individual consumption is justified in terms of supporting your brand based upon the stances that you take publicly. And that also has the capacity to breed a ton of shadow as well. Like Jung, if Jung was alive today, I'm sure Jung would have a ton to say about social justice as pertains in the online sphere and the shadows that are often papered over when dealing with these specific issues. I mean, it would be great. I mean, someone's individual moral stance on Black Lives Matter, for instance, or specific things to do with injustice and police brutality. I would expect everybody to have some form of stance on it. Depending on where they're at politically as well. Like, not everybody is politically developed. Some people don't even think about this stuff at all. And I mean, they should, but we're not in a system that facilitates that kind of political education. Most people don't learn about this stuff until they're either confronted of it in the real world, or if they run into certain circles online. I mean, most people don't learn about this stuff in a way that's sort of collectivized and organized. It's still sort of very disparate in terms of how people gain access to this knowledge. So it depends, in my opinion. I think there's like a lot of nuance to it, and I feel like you have to sort of look at why a person is saying something or why a person isn't saying something. It's not always because they just don't care, or they're just sort of oblivious to the injustices that are going on in the world. I think that for some people there may be a lack of understanding, or also just a fear of saying the wrong thing, or maybe they feel intense pressure to say something that they haven't really formulated or mulled over in their head properly yet. And to just sort of withdraw support from that person and kick them out of the family also kind of doesn't help them learn, if you know what I mean. Like, it doesn't aid in their process of evolution and self-reflection if they're just sort of completely being wiped off or pushed out. I feel like we need to have a bit more patience, because I'm seeing a lot of people sort of demanding stances from people without actually knowing that person's personal trajectory, where they are politically, what they know, what they feel. All of those different things, I think, play a role for sure.
Yeah, I love that you said that as well, because first of all, I'm writing some notes on for a video about social media and shadows relating to social media that I've seen and that I've felt relating to this. And also, I just did a chat in my private business group on Facebook where somebody was saying exactly that. I have a platform and I don't know where to start, and I don't know what to say, but I want to say something. And my response was, I think you should say that. First of all, don't forget there's loads of people that are way more qualified to talk about this stuff, that you could just share their stuff. You could just refer to their stuff and say, this seems very together. That's like, let me just put the spotlight on this person who has thought it through and is speaking in a way that does resonate with me, but I could never express that or put that together in my mind. And second of all, just say honestly that you don't know what to say and you are scared and confused, because a lot of people do feel that way, and I don't think you would be cancelled for that. I feel like a lot of people would feel comforted by someone who has a platform saying, you know what, I don't actually know. I know that what I'm seeing is wrong and it makes me upset, but I actually feel like I don't have a manifesto for this. I do not have a way of picking through this, and it scares and upsets me that that's what I have to say, just as I'm sure it scares and upsets a lot of you that you don't have the answers or the thing to say. So that was my advice.
There's incentive though, because a lot of people do come forward and say, they'll write a manifesto, even though they themselves aren't really involved in any sort of meaningful anti-racist action, or they're not well read on the subject, they don't know anything about it. But coming forward is incentivized because you get a lot of praise for it, your social capital increases, and in some cases your monetary capital increases as well when you do come forward, even if it's not coming from like a real place. And I also see a lot of people who come forward just to get people off their asses, not because they actually, or to make sure that their brand or their business isn't affected by any sort of scrutiny from the public, not because they actually deeply care about these issues, or because it's more just here's the thing that you're, trying to coerce out of me. Now can I get back to doing my thing that I normally do? I feel like when these conversations need to be had in a way where there's nuance and there's room to sort of allow people to breathe. Because if you're somebody who's a business owner in the spiritual community and you're having people, calling you a hypocrite, or you're having people saying that you don't deserve your platform, or you're having people sort of demand that you make a statement about this thing that you may not necessarily even know anything about, or aren't necessarily well versed in, you have only a few options available to you, which is to either say something haphazard to get people away from you so that you can continue as normal, say something or not say anything at all and continue to sort of be subject to the opinions of the, you know, the masses. Or, you know, the third option is saying, I don't know, you know, I think that what's going on is bad, but, you know, that's not incentivized, you know, it's not incentivized by the system. Twitter especially encourages hard stances on things. And the hard stances and the high drama is usually what gets the most attention. And I have seen quite a few people be like, I don't know, the thing that's going on is bad. I don't have solutions. I don't have manifesto. And the thing is, those statements tend to not get any attention at all. Like they get very little, they get very little engagement because that's not a hard stance. It's not something that puts you in alignment with the brand of, you know, because anti-racism now has become a brand, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. It's not something that puts you in lieu with the brand of anti-racism in that regard. So yeah, I'm quite skeptical about demanding these stances from people, because people are people. You don't really know where they're coming from. Performance on social media around your allyship or solidarity with any given issue is very different from what you actually do and like believe in real life. And you know, there are tons of cases where people say all the right passwords and say all the right things on social media, but then in real life they're doing the opposite. And I think it's kind of misguided to judge someone's morality based on what their brand performs on social media, because it's only a shadow of the overall truth of who we really are. But yeah, I'm not against people coming out and showing solidarity at all. I think that it's a great thing. And I mean, it's always nice to see, like, whenever like a movie reviewer that I enjoy says something about anti-racism, it's nice to see that they have a stance and that they care, or that they are educated on it. But it's the demanding of the performative aspect that kind of like makes me feel a bit like uneasy in that regard.
Yeah, and it makes sense that I would suggest something that's not incentivized, because my whole business group is about like not doing what you're being pushed into doing, and not going for the competition paradigm, and not like, you know, not chasing you know, the numbers. So it makes sense that I would suggest that, like, just be honest, wholesome way forward. It's like, but that is incentivized. That's a very good point. And I was just talking to a friend last night, actually. I wanted to know specifically how she was doing with all of the BLM stuff, since she's a Black woman herself, and she was saying that she sees things on social media, and one of the first things that she thinks lately is, how does that correlate with what you are like off of social media? Like, let's say you're in a situation where you have to uphold your anti-racist stance in the real world, would it still hold up there? And that's more what goes through her mind. And that makes complete sense. What kinds of things do you feel positive about, if anything, when it comes to politics and spirituality online, and what you've seen that's made, if anything, that's made you go, that's good, I'm liking that?
I think there's been a little bit more awareness about the material sort of links between politics and spirituality, especially because, you know, there was a time, you know, I guess the 2010s is like when wellness culture sort of took off, and was sort of being touted as like a solution to systemic issues in this really like pernicious kind of way that really obscured the class realities that most people who are working class, who work for a living, don't have access to the consumption choices that are being touted as solutions to their alienation and their issues. And I think there's like a little bit more awareness of the fact that, you know, these things help and these things are good, but they're not systemic solutions in that regard. I think that awareness is sort of bubbling up a little bit. for wellness, I have a wellness routine because I am in the position where I can have a wellness routine. But when I was working full time, that was incredibly inhibited, and incredibly, it wasn't something that I could engage in as much as I can now. And a lot of these things, especially because we exist under neoliberal capitalism, that's the ruling ideology. And for, I guess, like a very succinct definition of neoliberalism is basically market solutions to social problems. And the thing is, it's an ideology, one that we've all internalized this ideology. But the pernicious thing about neoliberalism is that it makes itself invisible. People don't see it as ideology; they see it as like the norm. It's the norm, and everything outside of that is abnormal. And historically there have been succinct efforts. It's not something that just arose organically. You talk about the Chicago School, where people from all kinds of different political backgrounds and economic backgrounds, and people in government, people in business, they got together and implemented this system of neoliberalism we see now, which is the market solves everything. The market is the answer to all your problems. And people have internalized that when it comes to social justice, and they've also internalized that when it comes to spirituality. And I think that that's incredibly dangerous. And by the market, I'm not saying that all businesses are bad, or no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the idea that these consumer solutions are what will solve systemic problems is what's bad. Of course, you can consume something that's going to make you feel better. Of course, you can consume something that can benefit your life, or that can, fix something that's wrong, or fix something in your life that needs help or whatever. But that doesn't mean that the overall systemic issue is addressed or taken care of. And it was a problem that I was noticing in spirituality. Like, people were talking about making poor people meditate, and how if more people just meditated, they would feel better about their circumstances and learn to accept their place in life. And really, like, people really touting this idea that adopting a specific spiritual paradigm, or doing some form of wellness, is the key to the systemic alienation that they're experiencing. And we don't actually have to address the material issues that people are going through. Like, for instance, making healthcare accessible, especially for Americans. America is a country where healthcare is not free like it is in the UK. But even here in the UK, because of our shitty Tory government, things are constantly being privatized. And I'm somebody who relies on the NHS for mental health care, and has relied on the NHS for mental health care for a while. And how with how badly defunded things are, how the waiting lists are incredibly long, how you have to jump through hoops and hoops of bureaucracy before even getting seen by somebody. These things are very difficult to gain access to, and it was sort of this tone deaf thing I was seeing, where a lot of spiritual people were sort of touting these sort of spiritual solutions that are often mediated through markets as a way to combat the ills that we face societally. Even though these things are very useful, I do yoga because I can afford to. I go to therapy now because I finally was able to get past the bureaucracy to do that. These things have definitely added to the quality of my life. So it's not me saying that these things are inherently bad. It's just that they're not solutions to the systemic, and oftentimes they're used by the system to obfuscate the systemic. And I wish there was more focus as spiritual people, and as people who are against racism and all forms of bigotry, on the systemic causes of a lot of the problems that we're seeing in society. They're deeply linked to the material conditions that we are under, and the cultural does not precede the material. It's from the material that culture arises. If we had a different material situation, we would have an entirely different culture. You would see an entirely different culture arise from those material conditions. The culture that we're in now arises from the material conditions we're in now, and these cultural solutions, unfortunately, are not a fix-all. And yeah, I guess I think there's a little bit more awareness of that now, even if it's an unconscious thing. I don't think it's necessarily conscious yet, but I think it's something that's sort of lingering in the back of the collective unconsciousness that needs to be sort of pushed a little bit, like pushed forward. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm optimistic, in the sense that I think people are sort of slowly starting to understand this a little bit more.
I agree. I've seen a lot more dialogue around that than I was seeing 10 years ago, but I've still got blind spots around it. Like, actually, the other day I was looking at your Twitter, and you made me think of something like, as is so often the way, darling. You made me think of something. Yeah, that sounds about right. But you said that you were actually writing a rather scathing criticism of the book White Fragility by Professor Robin DiAngelo.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah. I was finding it really interesting. And you were saying that this is what she goes out and does in the corporate world, the talks that she gives and everything. That's a business. That is like you said, a market solution to a social problem. And to what end? To what end would that really break down systems of oppression in a way that would allow her to still have her comfortable life and get her check cut? And I was like, that's actually a really good point. Like, it's a business idea, and it's not intended to get to the root of anything. That's not the point of it.
That's what the whole neoliberal paradigm, especially like liberal, like professional managerial class, touts. Literal, economic or not economic, sorry, market solutions to social problems. And what was particularly pernicious about Robin DiAngelo's book is the fact that it's targeted at workers who are an exploited class in and of themselves. There are already power imbalances within workplaces that aren't addressed, but by these sort of neoliberal thinkers, those power imbalances are completely justified. They're completely justified, and it's okay for them to basically propose market solutions through these in our world now. Workers have absolutely no representation in government. The majority of people who are in government are people who are members of the owning class, people who own businesses, people who own property, people who own land. And in workplaces, the only recourse you have is HR. And HR is not there to protect workers. HR is there to protect the business. Ask any woman who has brought forward a sexual assault case in a workplace. What is HR going to do? They're going to protect the business. They're going to try to pay her off. They're going to try to find reason to fire her. HR is there to protect the business. We don't have workers' unions anymore. Every single sort of footing in society for workers to sort of assert their rights over the owning class has been eroded. And that issue is never really paid attention to in the way that it should. And, people like Robin DiAngelo, like she's figured out a great way to sort of pathologize white people in a way that's sort of profitable. She's figured out this like perfect sort of distillation of making racism a problem of the mind rather than one of material realities. And she's selling her solution, paying her $10,000 to come do a talk to your employees, buying your book. This sort of endless self-excavation through consumption is the only way that you can absolve yourself of the original sin of being a white person in this society. And it's very, very pernicious. Anti-racism has become marketized. Anti-racism has been absorbed by the neoliberal mode. And I think that that's incredibly dangerous. But part of the reason why I'm constantly cancelled on Twitter is because when I make these critiques, people think that I'm saying anti-racism in and of itself is terrible. No, I'm saying that the neoliberal solutions that are being presented obfuscate the real work that would need to be done in order to have anti-racism actually take a foothold in our society. And these neoliberal solutions oftentimes cause more alienation, cause more division, and also make certain people very, very, very rich. She's made a killing. It's a New York Times bestseller. it's also she also is made a ton of money from going into the corporate world and most of the reason why these companies hire her in the first place is so that they can escape legal liability in case there are racial incidents in the workplace. They can just point to a thing and say, look, we have the certificate, we did the anti-racism thing, it's on the wall. It's like consuming your way out of a problem that society, yeah, literally consuming your, and that's what the professional managerial class and the owning class want, a way of sort of absolving themselves and washing their hands of these issues. And there's an entire market that's opened up in order for them to do that. The diversity industry is a real thing. It's a real thing, you know, it's a real proper like industry that's basically come up in order to pose itself as a solution to these problems. And that's the reality we live in. The reigning ideology is market solutions to social problems. So these aren't evil people. They're not like sitting in boardrooms. They're just following the incentives that the system places in front of them. And if nobody is criticizing this, then we're just going to continue to fall down this pernicious rabbit hole of neoliberalism and not actually address any of the social issues or any of the root causes of the social issues that we all care about, including me. There's a constituency of people out there who think because I make these critiques, I'm somehow like a crypto fascist, or I'm like against anti-racism, or I'm this like awful, terrible person who's hiding my own self-hatred and bigotry. And it's like, no, I'm against neoliberal solutions to social issues. And I don't think that they do as much as they purport to. I think we need to look at the material, and I'm suspicious of anything that tries to obfuscate the material. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting ranty.
No, I know, because I knew, I was like, okay, you're kind of going off script by bringing up Robin DiAngelo, but you kind of feel like you want to, so just do it. I was like, I'm going to do it, because it really made me think.
I have a podcast called Low Society. I'm a co-host. We did an entire episode on white fragility. So if you want a more succinct take on what I think about the book, because we read the book and then we did like an entire episode sort of breaking it down. So that's out there if you want to check that out as well.
Yes, definitely. And I'll link it down below if it's open to everybody. I'll link it down below as well.
I mean, it's the same thing as Jordan Peterson, for instance, who is a Jungian, ironically as well, a Jungian psychology professor. And a few years ago, he brought out a book called 12 Rules for Life. And that's the thing. The right wing is neoliberal in the same way that liberals are neoliberal. They both believe in the same ideology, which is market solutions to social problems. And Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life book was basically justification. It was aimed towards alienated, usually white men, basically, who feel alienated by society. But the whole crux of the book is your alienation has nothing to do with anything systemic. It's all about your individual choices. Like the whole edict of the book was clean your room, take personal responsibility, pull your pants up. Your alienation has nothing to do with anything systemic. It's all about your personal failures as a person, your inability to cope with things as they are. So in that sense, I see 12 Rules for Life as being the right-wing equivalent of white fragility in that regard. It's selling these sort of marketed solutions and kind of putting the onus on the individual for systemic problems. There's a reason why, white men are feeling alienated. There's a reason why Black people are shot in the streets. There are systemic reasons for these issues. And a lot of it boils down to the material conditions and the material circumstances that we exist under. And yes, some people suffer worse under those material conditions, i.e. people from marginalized backgrounds suffer worse under those material conditions. But we're all suffering under these material conditions. Every single last one of us is suffering in some form or another. But anything that sort of tries to address that is seen as dangerous or too subversive and needs to be sort of shut down. It's really complicated, but like I'm very suspicious of these proposed market solutions in that regard.
Yeah. Well, like I've read two phrases a lot since this sort of wave of the discussion around Black Lives Matter and police brutality and stuff really sort of I'd see it as the first time I've seen it really break through, is what I would describe it as. And the two phrases are optical allyship and performative activism. And obviously, like, there's so many people, myself included, who would like to, I would like to believe that that is not what's happening with me. And I would also like to know what that is supposed to look like. And is it something that you can only identify through engaging with somebody's work first and then being like, I feel like this is optical allyship. I sense that this is performative. On some level, that's how I judge it. Or can you actually see from straight away what it is? And if so, what is it? What does it look like?
Well, I give you an example. I mean, there was this really weird thing that went around where white liberals were like washing black people's feet. There was like a whole, it was like a ceremony that they were doing or whatever, where they were washing. It was like a apology for racism thing where they were sort of washing black people's feet in this sort of way of like doing penance for the crime of their material or systemic position or whatever. For me, when we're talking about performative allyship, I don't even believe in the concept of allyship. I believe in the concept of solidarity. First and foremost, solidarity is where my head is at. I think allyship is a bunch of bullshit. But for me, performative allyship basically boils down to, number one, things that sort of they obfuscate the real issues that are happening around anti-racism and then become focused on what makes white people feel more at ease within themselves, makes white people feel more at ease within like their systemic position. And also, so that's number one. Number two, performative allyship is also about anything that obscures the material circumstances that cause these issues to happen. We are in it, like I said, we're in a situation where workers have absolutely no representation governmentally. Most of our governments are filled with people from the earning class. We have no recourses in our workplaces. There are areas of shared solidarity that we need to be fighting around, especially when it comes to police brutality. Black struggle is the universal struggle because it's emblematic of every single cruelty and excess of the system that we're under. And I don't like that Black struggle is now becoming this sort of racialized narrative when it's a universal narrative. If you're for Black struggle, you're for the emancipation of all people, you're for the emancipation of even yourself, because there are certain ways that you are also affected by the excesses and cruelties of the current system that we're under. So I believe in the idea of solidarity, people working together in solidarity. Allyship kind of, it implies a hierarchy, and that hierarchical sort of relationship is where you see a lot of that performative allyship take hold. The idea that I need to show everyone how anti-racist I am. I need to show everyone how much in solidarity I am. I need to show people that I'm not like those other whites. It, again, individualizes the systemic problem. White supremacy is a systemic issue. And a lot of it is codified unconsciously because of the societal messages that we get sent. The individual white person in the streets isn't necessarily emblematic. There are ways that they can participate in white supremacy. There are ways that they can use white supremacy as leverage over other people. But this sort of narrative that's being spun treats the individual white person in the street as if they are an emblem of white supremacy simply by existing. And, white supremacy is original sin, and every single action you needs to be to absolve yourself of that sin. It individualizes the systemic problem to the point where so much energy gets wasted on white people trying to sort of absolve themselves and cleanse themselves of this sin, rather than just acting in in solidarity with people of color. That's what I need. I don't need allies. I need comrades. Like, I don't need someone to be allied with me. I need people to, like, for instance, the building I live in right now, we're trying to unionize. We're trying to organize a rent strike. We have incredibly predatory landlords. And, that's a shared thing. And a lot of the people, because I don't live in a very well-off area, a lot of the people who are in my building are poor, working class people of color. But there are also white people in the building too who are poor and who are also being taken advantage of by the same system. There are ways that we can collectivize around shared interests. And when it
Sure.
comes to police brutality, there's a massive shared interest in that regard. And everybody who is against police brutality should see it not just as this racialized others fight, but our collective fight for justice and for a society that doesn't brutalize its citizens. Which is why
I agree with that. But like, if you're a white person, you have to acknowledge that your likelihood of being exposed to police brutality is nowhere near as high whatsoever as So I think, to me, the allyship, first of all, I don't claim the word ally, because I feel like if someone wants to bestow that upon a person, that's fine and they can utilize that. But I also no longer have it as part of my lexicon. And in my original Black Lives Matter video, which I put out in 2016, I've actually got a note underneath it now that says, one thing I would change about this video is I would not describe myself as an ally, and I would not use the term allyship. I think that it can be problematic. I also agree with you that I think solidarity is a better way to go, but I never saw allyship as having any hierarchical suggestion to it. I always saw it as being an ally. To me, is like saying, I'm aware that I'm not directly affected in the same way as you by this struggle, so I'm not going to be taking the mic. I'm going to be doing what you need me to do. You tell me what you need me to do. You would know better than I what needs to happen. So as an ally, I'm not going to be leading from the front. I'm going to be somebody who's here to carry things, pick things up, hammer things in, do whatever it is you need me to do. So I always see it as, maybe it is hierarchical in a sense, but it's almost like saying, I get that I'm not the main player here, and I get that I want to be involved, but not in a way where I'm going to come in and tell you what's going to happen.
I understand the sentiment in that regard, but these things are linked. Police brutality against Black people doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's linked to all kinds of different socioeconomic issues and political issues that are broad, that don't just affect the Black community. All of these different struggles that are faced by people of color, but that are faced by, people from migrant backgrounds, that are faced by people who are LGBT, for instance, they're not separate. And I feel like this paradigm tries to sort of separate them in a way that says, this is your issue and I'm just here for the ride. These are all collectively our issues together. And that's the reason why I'm sort of against this idea of allyship or someone having to take the back seat, because if there are people in your community who are being brutalized by the police, that is your problem too. That's a thing that affects you. And that very problem is probably also linked to things that affect you, even if you're not suffering the brunt of it. Under the system, we have justifying ideologies like racism, like sexism, like homophobia they're used to justify the suppression of other people much more than other people from different backgrounds might be repressed. But that doesn't mean that we don't all have collective gain in these issues that supposedly don't affect us, because they do. The fact of the matter is, in my mind, these things are linked. And that's why an attitude of solidarity should be taken rather than an attitude of allyship, because it turns Black people into this racialized other. This is a thing that's happening to you in your own community, and I'm just sort of here for the ride. It sort of essentializes Black people and sort of puts us out as this caste of a racialized other, rather than, this is an issue that's happening in my community as well. This is an issue that is linked to other economic and socio-political issues that I'm also affected by. This issue just sort of, it distills it down to its purest form. Like, when it comes to Black issues, it's sort of a Hegelian universal, because, like I said, Black liberation is basically, it's emblematic of every single excess and every single cruelty of capitalism, but like distilled down into its like purest form, which is why it's a universal fight, in my opinion. Like, it's a universalist fight. It's not just a fight for a specific community that's separate from all others. Like and the only way that we're ever going to be able to sort of overcome the problems we face as a society is as a collective. I'm very suspicious of how, you know, this sort of allyship model racializes the issue while also making people who have vested interest in these issues being solved think that it's something that's separate from them, or that doesn't affect them, simply because they're not the ones that are suffering the worst. They're linked to things. It's linked. These things are linked. They don't just occur in a vacuum, if I'm making any sense at all.
Yeah. I'd have to think about it more in terms of like the discussion we're having about semantics, because I have found, having a few of the conversations that I've had in the last month or so, that there are some Black people who cannot accept or believe that white people who have a vested interest in Black Lives Matter, and who also have a vested interest in showing solidarity with groups that they don't share the exact same lived experiences with, are doing it for anything other than their own gain. They cannot envision, and I guess that's fucking probably fair, considering what their lived experiences have been. They struggle. They're like, what's in it for you? Why else would you can't actually care about it? And I'm like, oh no,
we have shared class
interests. It deeply affects me. I'm very troubled by it, honestly.
Yeah, but also it's not just a question of empathy. It's not just a question of you know, feeling morally obligated. It's also a question of shared class interests, which is why I would disagree with other Black people who think that there's no reason that white people should ever be in solidarity with any of the issues that specifically affect us, because we have shared class interests. Like like I said, we have a ruling class that enforces a specific class hierarchy. And the lower you are on the class hierarchy, the more shit you get. The majority of the Black folks that have been shot and killed by police are usually from economically disenfranchised backgrounds. These are the people who don't have the money to fight back, to get lawyers, who the criminal justice system can abuse. There's an entire system that is set up, like the prison industrial complex, that profits from putting Black people in prison for minor issues, like drug offenses or this or that. You know, there's an entire system that's set up to profit off of Black death and also Black misery and suffering. And the reason why we're suffering the brunt of this is because we're lower on the socioeconomic rung and we have less power institutionally to fight back. And that doesn't just stop at us. It's also a lot of other communities as well. We just happen to be the emblem, which is why I say that it's a universal fight, because Black issues are sort of a distillation of everything that's wrong with the system. And we have shared class interests with other people who are members of the poor and the working class. We have the shared class interest with those people to join together in solidarity and fight for our interests. And Black issues don't just stop at police brutality. Housing, education, healthcare, all of these are deeply linked to the class fight. I mean, in America, for instance, if universal healthcare was implemented, that would exponentially improve the lives of African Americans. If the educational system was funded better, if it wasn't based upon, you know, the income of whatever neighborhood you live in or whatever, because those things have been used. Like, capitalism is always used as a tool to oppress Black people. The education system it's like an economic tool to sort of gatekeep people of color away from access to better standards of living and economic mobility. And these are the reasons why we're so vulnerable to attacks from the state. Like, for instance, in America, the way that their school systems are funded, it depends on the tax bracket of the neighborhood. So if you're in a neighborhood that has a low income tax bracket, then you're less likely to see your schools funded properly in that regard. And that definitely goes on to affect the prospects of Black people and their ability to thrive and their ability to gain economic mobility. The healthcare system, you know, education, food, all of these basic material necessities hit Black communities harder. So it doesn't just stop at police brutality. The reason that the police are able to brutalize us in the way that they do is because we're vulnerable and we don't have institutional power that will defend us in the way that other communities do. And therefore we have the boot of capital on our neck harder. That doesn't mean other communities don't have the boot of capital on their neck. We all do, which is the reason why we need to join together around shared class interest, because it's a universal fight. It's not just this racialized other community and their problems that I'm not affected by, which means that I'm an ally. I'm just kind of here for the ride to show my moral solidarity and fulfill my moral obligations to this thing. It's not about your morality at all. It's about the fact that you have shared interests with those who are being oppressed. All of us have those, and those shared interests have been abstracted by the system we're in. They make us all feel like we're separated from one another. They make us feel as if we have no shared interests and that we're all just sort of, tourists in each other's suffering, which I think is absolutely awful. But yeah, sorry, ranting. Getting ranty.
No, that's what I asked you here for, my love.
Yeah.
No, I really, like I said, I'm going to have a word with myself after this about linguistics and semantics and other words and the mean language and words and things. But because I'm wondering if the wording I use actually makes maybe some people, with some of the conversations that I have had privately, mistake what I'm saying completely, because I don't disagree with anything you've said. I completely resonate with everything you've said, and I'm wondering if my own the language that I feel has been available to me to explain and express my own interest in solidarity has actually made it sound as though I feel like I'm along for the ride, and I don't. It's no, we're all on the ride and we should all get off. That's my feeling.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm just hopping on for the day to see what it's like. Oh, it's awful. I'll fuck off now.
That way, because we've all, even Black people, have internalized the logic of our system. Every single person has internalized the logic of neoliberalism. It's one that atomizes us. It's one that separates us from one another and makes us feel like we're, tourists in each other's oppression. If look at like LGBT housing discrimination, for instance, that's a material issue that affects LGBT people, that I see as affecting my interests, because I'm also a member of the poor and working class. I don't see that as being separate from my issues. I don't see LGBT people as this sort of sexualized other, and that's their problem. And I'm just here to fulfill my moral obligation by making nods to this community. I see it as a collective struggle for liberation. But because the system we're under atomizes us, everyone sort of feels like they need to be protective over their group and over their turf, and anyone who's an outsider from their specific identity group must have some form of nefarious agenda. And even then, the system incentivizes others from different groups to sort of act as tourists in other people's oppression and to perform solidarity in a way that oftentimes can materially benefit them, like the book White Fragility, for instance. It's a mess, and not enough work has been done to sort of unpick the abstractions in these issues. People just sort of expect you to take the social justice edict at face value. And if you don't, and if you have questions, then, or if you want to sort of analyze and unpick them, then that shows that you're against social justice and you don't have solidarity and you're a terrible person and you should be canceled and no one should ever talk to you again and you're just awful, basically. And it's like, no, we need to go back to the drawing board when it comes to social justice. We need to do our shadow work when it comes to social justice, because it's not just it's not just internal issues that we have in terms of human nature, blah blah blah. Human nature is exponentially affected by the systems that we're under. And we're under systems that incentivize certain kinds of thinking, certain kinds of behavior, certain kinds of attitudes and affects. And of course, those are going to worm their way into our ability to achieve social justice and the modes of operation that we use to attain it. So yeah, we really do need to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate a lot of the things that we do, reevaluate a lot of the truisms that we put out into the public. We really need to go back to the drawing board and analyze a lot of this stuff, over again, because I don't want white people to see me as a racialized other. I want them to see me as human and as part of the struggle for human rights and liberation, you know, for all of us against the owning class. That's what I want. I don't want, and especially if you read White Fragility, the way that it otherizes and racializes Black people is terrifying. Like, it's as if like we're not people, we're this permanently racialized other, and none of the issues that affect us have anything to do with white people. White people just need to do better and consume better and fulfill their moral obligations towards Black people by making nods towards us publicly and performing them. And it's not, it's disastrous. It makes me feel more alienated than I've ever been as a Black person from white people, you know. And it also makes white people neurotic around Black people, like they need to tread on eggshells, you know. It makes white, and I can tell when I'm talking to a white person who's like read White Fragility, and they feel like they need to have the entire history of racial oppression in their head before they can even address me or say a specific sentence to me. No, I'm a person. And yes, people from my background suffer more because of, you know, the way that capitalism has used us as the kind of linchpin for its cruelty. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a shared interest in my liberation. It doesn't mean that I don't have shared interest in your liberation. And I feel like the more people see it that way, the less awkward and gross and there's nothing essential about race. There's nothing, and that's what this sort of ideology does. It essentializes people and it divides people, you know. It's only an accident of birth that I was born a Black woman at the end of the day. It was only an accident of birth that you were born a white woman at the end of the day. We're on this planet now, and you know what? Coronavirus, the economic situation that this coronavirus has caused, has left millions of people unemployed. Workers have no representation in government and no due recourse in their workplace. People are being fired left and right. The NHS is being privatized in America, the healthcare system. People are losing their homes. These issues exponentially affect people of color more because, like I said, we're the linchpin of all of the bullshit that capitalism decides to throw at people. So if you want to show solidarity, join with me in shared class struggle, please. I don't need you to wash my feet. I don't need you to kneel down. Oh, sorry. I don't need you. I'm causing earthquakes. I don't need you. I don't need you to wash my feet. I don't need you to consume endless anti-racist content. I don't need you to renounce your white privilege or any of that nonsense. I need you to join with me in shared class struggle so that people can have access to better material circumstances and increase their quality of life. That's what I'm interested in. And I feel like that gets obfuscated by these sort of the way that the system atomizes us, pulls us apart, and doesn't make us see shared interest and humanity in each other. You know, it's weird.
Yeah. So you want the tide to rise all boats, essentially, like it will, and that will. If we start focusing on shared class struggle, then we are focusing on Black issues. It makes sense that there's
Black struggle is class struggle. It's a form of class struggle. It always has been. It's always been a class struggle. There's no separation between class struggle and Black struggle. It's like capitalism in and of itself was basically codified upon the backs of the chattel slave system. The chattel slave system was what enabled the system that we have today to exist. Black struggle and all of the Black struggles that are lionized now as, you know, the pinnacle of civil rights were all deeply anti-capitalist. All of them, the Black Panthers, even Martin Luther King himself, even though his legacy was sort of whitewashed and he was sort of turned into this, like, you know, nice little kind of alternative to radical, you know, anti-capitalist struggle. Martin Luther King was a socialist. And the fact of the matter is that was when they killed him. They killed him when he started talking socialist shit. They were like, oh yeah, we'll make concessions for all of this, you know, Black identity stuff. We'll integrate lunch counters. We'll do whatever we can to sort of absolve ourselves of this stuff. But you're talking about poor people gathering together in solidarity. We can't fucking have that. We're gonna fucking assassinate you. All of these Black civil rights struggles that we lionize today as the bastions of civil rights, they were deeply, deeply anti-capitalist. And they also understood that the only way forward was for us to join together as a collective and fight for our shared class interests.
I hear you so much on that. I feel with a lot of the understanding that I have of it is like, we can talk about black and white all day, but don't touch the color green. Once you start touching the color green, we will have you murked.
Yeah. Why do you think so many corporations and companies have come out, you know, to tacitly show support for Black Lives Matter? Because if they can convince us that, you know, we don't discriminate on grounds of race, but if you're somebody who can't access something because of economics, that's totally just because the system is just. So if a Black billionaire like Oprah Winfrey, for instance, gets barred from entering, I don't know, Chanel, that's a grave injustice, and we are going to yell about that all day on Twitter. But you can't get access to healthcare because you're poor. Well, you must have failed somehow in your life. You know, you didn't take personal responsibility. You know, it's justified. All of these economic, all discrimination and barring people from access to, you know, the things that we should have because we escaped the birth canal. The fact that you're alive means you should have access to good healthcare, good housing, that you should have access to life. But to the current sort of neoliberal paradigm, that's not the case. Any sort of economic injustice is fine. So long as it, you know, now we can say we're inclusive. We can say we're inclusive, even though the majority of the people that they're saying they're inclusive for are not members of the middle class or the upper class. They're poor people. Poor people, and the things that affect poor people disproportionately affect people of color. Like, I don't care that you know, Anna Wintour decided to come out and say that she's now inclusive, or that, you know, luxury brands are now saying that they're inclusive. Like, what does that put food on my table? Does that address the material concerns that I have? Not really. No, it doesn't. It just creates diversity within the upper class. And it seems as if like a lot of these calls for social justice are basically there to sort of create diversity within the upper class, create the image of inclusion, while kind of obfuscating the material realities that Black and working class people face. Like, you know, like I said, most of the victims of police brutality are Black, working class, or poor. The victim in this specific case was arrested because he was forging checks. Why was he doing that? Because he's poor. He's a poor person. Someone was also shot because they were selling loose cigarettes on the side of the street. What kind of economic desperation, you know, are we talking about here? Poor people. We're talking about, and nobody wants to look at the underlying systemic issues, the underlying material issues. They just want pretty images. They want pretty images of inclusion to make them feel better about the world. And they don't want to actually do anything to deal with the problem. And it's frustrating because, you know, making these critiques oftentimes make people feel like you're against social justice and that you're someone who thinks that it's useless or that it's bad. But I'm very much for social justice, which is the reason why I'm so concerned and why it's something that I feel so strongly about, and why I make these sometimes strong off the wall critiques, because I deeply care about this stuff and I want to see it work, and I don't want to see it obfuscated. I don't want to see it recuperated by our current system.
Yeah, and I'm very interested to know what the comments will be underneath this video, and that I think
I'm sure people are going to be pretty mad about it. I'm sure people are going to who is this person that you've got on your channel, Kelly? I hope you don't get any blowback for any of the things that I'm saying. Come at me. Leave Kelly alone.
Protect me at all costs. I wanted to ask you about capitalism and witchcraft as well, like, because there's been quite a bit going on in that area of things. I wrote a few things down. First of all, that there's been a dialogue around consumerism in witchcraft. Freya Norling, who's got this amazing Norse pagan witch channel, she's legit. She's literally out there in the middle of like buttfuck Finland or wherever, like living in she's like a witch from the old days. It's wild. It's beautiful. It's all very high, like very expertly done, and obviously they're filmmakers, and it's filmmaker quality. It's gorgeous. It's not like she's literally out there with no technology. She's out there with full technology, and everyone's here for it. But she's like a Norse witch, and she made this made this video about saying no to plastic witchcraft, saying no essentially to like empty consumerist witchcraft. And then people started to have a discussion about waste and about like why are we buying these things to put onto our altars that we have no idea how they were made or how ethically they were made, and they've got a massive carbon footprint, and they're just feeding into a really unjust, unfair capitalist system. And then on top of that, or around the same time, there was a dialogue about these witchy boxes that you can order, these monthly witchy boxes that come, and they have just like a mishmash of different things in, none of which you specifically ordered or may have needed, but it's just like, surprise, this is a bunch of stuff you can use. And again, no real information, I think, most of the time about where these things come from, how they were sourced, where they were made, etc. And I was kind of, you know, sitting and wondering about these different things and wondering what your views are on, you know, sort of bringing ethics to the undeniable connection between objects and witchcraft, because they're, you know, for the vast majority of us, there is a connection. And a lot of people are, you know, involved in getting the witchy boxes, or maybe not being super conscious of what they are purchasing and what it is for. And you know, saying no to plastic witchcraft, I think part of that dialogue is literally about plastic, so it's literally about environmentalism and how that overlaps with consumerism. What's your feeling about witchcraft and consumerism?
Well, you see, I've got my altar right there, if you can see. It's right there. But yeah, I guess there's a lot to unpack in this regard. So I guess the first thing I would say is that there's no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. And one of the major issues with this sort of neoliberal paradigm, which we've all internalized, is the idea of individual consumption choices solving systemic issues, which is kind of bullshit in my view. Individual consumption.
Don't get me started on the straws. Don't get me started.
Yeah, the straws. Individual straws. Yeah.
Starbucks is going to carry on doing what it's doing. All right, we're going to carry on culling the rainfoot. Never mind. Who's Monsanto? We don't know her. Put that down. It's your fault. It's like, what the hell?
Your consumption choices are ruining the world, don't you know? It has nothing to do with these corporations. It has absolutely nothing to do with, you know, the fact that these corporations are at fault for the majority of the pollution that goes on. It doesn't matter that we live in a system that is depleting the earth of its resources. No, it's you. It's because you bought the thing that's bad. And like, that critique never sits well with me in that regard. You know, and then again, I've seen the sort of natural witchcraft or natural witchcraft community sort of come up, and all it is another consumption path. In the same way that, you know, it's another consumption path and I'm always very skeptical of the idea of ethical consumption, or whenever a company or an influencer or somebody comes along to try to tout themselves as an ethical alternative, when there is no such thing as ethical alternatives under capitalism. And if you feel better consuming ethically, then that's great. But really and truly, it's not a solution to the systemic issues. I don't judge people for what they purchase. I don't judge people for what they buy. Like, the majority of my money goes towards buying tarot decks. And, you know, I'm like a magpie. Like, if I see something in a shop that I think would look good on my altar, I buy it because, you know, whatever. It's your individual consumer choices. Your individual consumer choices do not solve systemic problems. And the energy that's sort of used to police individuals and what they're buying and this and that kind of busybody energy could be aimed at the corporations that are the ones that are responsible for the production of these things, or responsible for the majority of the pollution that goes on. If you want to make a personal consumer choice not to consume witchy items that are fast made or fast crafted, and you want to pay for something that's handcrafted or ethically sourced, then that's all well and good. But it doesn't solve the overall issue of pollution on our planet. It doesn't solve the overall issue that we have an economic system that encourages and that is fed by the depletion of the resources of the earth and the destruction of our environments. If you're a witch and you feel deeply about the the plight of the planet, and you feel very deeply about our trajectory, then you need to look at the economic reasons, and you need to look at the main culprit, which is capital. It's not about you basically conspicuously showing people that you're making ethical choices with what you choose to consume. That is not a solve for the massive systemic issues that we're seeing. And it's not activism, because consumption is not activism. Consumption can never be activism. And that doesn't mean that it's not a good thing if you want to buy something handmade or handcrafted or ethically sourced. It doesn't mean that it's bad of you to decide to make that consumer choice. But then don't tout your consumer choice as activism, number one, and then don't shame other people because there are a lot of the stuff that's handmade and ethically sourced tends to be more expensive, and a lot of the reason why people buy the cheap stuff is the bad stuff is because it's cheap and it's easily available to them.
Right.
There's no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism to begin with. Every single thing that we consume under the system has some form of exploitation attached to it. So to then go and shame people and make people feel bad, or make it their individual responsibility to solve the problems of the earth, or solve the problems of society through their consumption choices, is somewhat misguided. Like, you could literally have a vegan diet, drive a Prius, live in a earth dome, do all of the consumer things, buy 10,000 anti-racism books, make all of the consumer choices that are quote unquote ethical. But that's not going to solve the systemic problems. But I don't blame people for thinking this way, because we live in a society that tells us that every problem can be solved through the market. And if there's a problem, all that needs to occur is a new market. All that needs to happen is that a new market springs up to cater to this issue. So, it's internalized logic of what we've been taught since day one. It's the ideology that we've all internalized. But the thing is, like I said, it's pernicious, because neoliberalism basically is like, it's not an ideology. It's just the natural way of things. So nobody really questions the ideological frameworks that we're all sort of working under. So no, if there's a witchy company that's doing these loot boxes and there's like a lot of waste and stuff, I can understand why there would be ethical quandaries about that. But you want to sort of address those issues with the company themselves, not the people who are consuming it. And you don't want to start shaming those people for consuming it either. And just because there's an ethical alternative doesn't mean that is the solution either. The solution is systemic. It doesn't just affect the witchy community. Makeup produces a lot of waste. The fashion industry produces a lot of waste and pollution. Like, basically all the things that we need to survive, our phones, the very devices that we're talking on right now, all of these things produce a ton of waste. And it's the system that we're in, and these corporations, these companies, that are the ones that the blame and the responsibility needs to be levied at, not the individual person and their consumption choices. But a lot of people get really mean and judgy about people who they see or perceive as not consuming correctly or not making the correct consumption choices in that regard. And that doesn't sit well with me at all.
I agree. I've had so many conversations with my friends about like individual consumer guilt being absolutely a part of what helps the capitalist machine keep running. And if you you buy this cup of coffee and we'll put 50p back into the rainforest, we're actually tearing it down at a really alarming rate. But if you want to get out of your sense of individual guilt, which we want to put onto you, so that you don't look at us and what we're doing, then we can give you this. We can like commodify that guilt. We actually
which is what they're doing.
By it. We're let off the hook by it, and we get more money from you for it, because we can give you this little out. Buy this coffee, we'll plant a tree. We've just ripped up a fuckload of trees. We orangutans are going extinct because of us, but if you buy this coffee, then we'll alleviate you of your individual guilt for something that is a rolling machine that you could never have any way of stopping yourself. And that makes complete sense. And I think, to me, if somebody is going to make the decision not to buy something they feel is unethically made, like you said, it's fast made, there's some ethical quandaries around it, fine. But instead of, like you said, touting that as activism, take that to its logical conclusion, which is, where is the company that's making this stuff? Let's sort that out. Let's go to that. Like, it's not just going to be about me saying I don't buy witchy boxes and you shouldn't either, and that's it. But it should be about, okay, let's have a look at the actual system, the machine. It's like when a company is exposed for using factories where there's child labor, and in the past those companies would just be like, well, we just cut ties with that factory. Now we don't use that factory anymore. We're sorry, we didn't know that 11-year-olds were sewing sequins onto these tops. Now we know, we've moved on to a more ethical factory. And it's like, okay, so what you're saying is you've done nothing about the factory. The factory's still there using the child labor. The factory's still there working people to the bone, but you've moved on so that another sports company can come in, and like, there's no responsibility taken. It's like, we've cut ties from that and we're moving on. And I think individuals who claim a concern about ethics and about these things are almost doing the same. They're like, well, I'm taking my money out of those witchy boxes, or I don't buy that plastic shit from China, so now I can sort of say, like you said, tout that as my activism and let that be the end of it, rather than questioning capitalism as a system.
Yeah, but I feel like that's the reason. Sorry.
Yeah, you go.
I was just going to say, I feel like that's the reason why people are so hostile towards these kinds of critiques, because they're like, I found my out. You know, nobody wants to feel like they're bad, and no one wants to feel like they are culpable in anything that's bad. And they attach morality to these issues rather than just looking at the cold, hard material reality of the fact that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, and your individual consumer choices are not activism, and they're not systemic solutions. People don't like to hear that, because it's like, well, does that mean I'm a bad person? Does that mean that I could be doing better? Like, it's all about shifting the guilt away from capital and putting it onto the individual. And they've done it with witchcraft and spirituality. They're doing it with anti-racism. They've done it with LGBT stuff. They do it with everything. Every single area of even our social lives are subject to the norms of neoliberalism. And that is scary, and it's getting worse. It's getting worse. Even the arts, even creativity, even the modes through which we express ourselves are all subject to this ideology, the ruling ideology, the reigning ideology, the ideology that every single facet of life is filtered through. And, you know, it's kind dystopian when you think about it, but thinking about it is the first kind of step towards pushing back against it. And the thing is, most people just don't think about it. And it's not their fault that they don't think about it, because, you know, the kind of critique that people like me make, Marxists make, is intensely marginalized. You know, there's even, you know, the Marxists have been killed. Marxists have been like, you know, there's been an intense pushback from the state and capital towards popularizing these sorts of ideas that question the systemic incentives and sort of shift the focus away from individuals. I mean, it's like the same thing with cancel culture. The fervency with which people go to cancel someone, again, is sort of like that person becomes the emblem of all that is bad, the emblem of, and by getting rid of this person, we've defeated the bad thing. And it's like, no, the bad thing still exists. The bad thing is still there. And, you know, canceling this person isn't going to solve the bad thing. It's not, it may make you feel a sense of catharsis. It may make you feel like you've done your activism for the day, but we need to, in order to really shift things, we need to focus on the material issues that are afoot. And I feel like in the spiritual community, these conversations need to be had. Like, people need to understand that demonizing people for their individual consumption choices ain't it. It's not it. And also demonizing people, it's always black and white. People think that anti-capitalism is about anti-consumerism. There's a big difference between anti-consumerism is a liberal kind of paradigm, because it's about, you know, putting the onus on the individual and individual consumption. Anti-capitalism is about being against a system in which the majority of the wealth and power is concentrated into the owning class, the people who own and extract value from people, the people who don't actually work to create value, which is workers. Workers are the ones who work to create value. Capitalists are the class that extract that value. And being anti-capitalist is about being against that system. It's not about anti-consumerist arguments, which are largely kind of rooted in neoliberal ways of thinking. So no, I'm not anti-consumerist at all. I try to make the choices that I can afford to make, basically. And I try to be conscious about the choices but I'm also a human being, and I don't have a whole lot of time to research what this is and what that is, and where this is coming from and where that's coming from, and putting that onus on the individual rather than looking at the systemic is really wrongheaded. And I feel like it's why so many people are drawn to the right, or why so many people just tune politics out completely, because so much of what the so-called left, which I don't actually believe is the left, I think that they're liberals, which is different from the left, but so much of what the so-called left push out sounds like so much like right-wing stuff, individual responsibility, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, you know, you're inherently bad because you were born a certain way, you have original sin, you need to do penance, it's not about collectivism or solidarity or joining people together around shared interests. It's all about, this endless self-flagellation or endless flagellation of others, or endless, judgment. And it can oftentimes play itself out in incredibly cruel ways. And I've seen a lot of that cruelty on social media from people who feel like they're on a moral crusade. But it's never levied against the system. It's always levied against like ruining some individual, or punching at some individual, or demonizing some individual. And it just creates more division, and it's not good.
Yeah. I want to this has been so I need to sit down after this and journal. Like, if that's a way of saying how enriching that's been, then that it's been so enriching. I need to sit and think about a lot of things. I recently joined your Patreon because I feel like there's so much. I know that there's, every time I think about some of the things we talked about last time and bits and pieces that I've come across from you since then, I felt like I feel like Patreon's going to include a mother load. Like, there's obviously discourse happening in there. There's obviously other things in there where I can get to grips with what I actually want to do and how I want to channel my energy. And as you said, how to reroute it from like the individualism paradigm to like a collective and like a systemic paradigm. So I'm excited about Patreon. I've only just joined your Patreon, and I wanted to end things by asking, first of all, is there anything you want people to know aside from what's happening with Patreon? And if someone wanted to join your Patreon off the back of listening to this and finding their mind very pleasantly blown, what would they find inside your Patreon? Oh,
thank you. Thank you for plugging my Patreon. Yeah, definitely. Every little helps. As much as I'm, always railing against capitalism, we all live under it. So a girl's got to eat.
Patreon is one of the most wholesome and ethical ways to make money on the internet. Like, if you like me and you like what I provide for free, tip me and I can make more, and I don't have to do it on the, like, after I've done my 40 hours a week somewhere. I do it in the middle of the night, which is what I started doing, and that's what a lot of people do. I did film my shit in the middle of the night, and it only came to the point where people were paying me for what I genuinely and purely do, that I could stop doing the other thing and really get some rest and do this properly. I think Patreon's amazing.
Also, Patreon at the moment, even though it has its flaws in that regard, it's the only way that people like me who make this sort of analysis can really continue to do it and get by, because this kind of analysis isn't incentivized at all by any of the systems that we're on. These systems really, they deplete our ability to find nuance. They also deplete our ability to find common ground, because it sets everything up as, this versus this, enemy versus enemy. It's all very high stakes. So, I feel, not just me, like all of the sort of calm voices, all of the people who are doing the systemic critiques and who are sort of trying to shift things away from this individualist paradigm, support them too, because this sort of thing is not incentivized. This sort of thing is really heavy. Like, the reason why I made the joke at the beginning that I get cancelled every 2 weeks is specifically because of these things that I say, the sort of analysis that I'm bringing forward, because it goes against the sort of neoliberal social justice mode. It's seen as like dangerous and that something that needs to be, you know, taken off or whatever. So yeah, not just me, like all of the people who you find out there who are doing this sort of thing, support them so that we can continue to sort of do the work of unpicking this stuff and finding better ways and better modes to achieve the things that we all care about as a collective. But yeah, on Patreon, I do a monthly like live stream which I'm due to do very soon, where I just shoot the shit with my Patreons and sort of talk about stuff, but it's a little bit more interactive since people can ask questions than it would be if I was on YouTube, where it's like too much. I also give out I also give as like a thank you thing for when people pledge $5 and above. I do like a little tarot reading for people in the Discord. I also have a Discord server where people have access to each other to discuss each other. I'm quite hands off with it because another thing that I really don't like about the systems that we're in on social media is the sort of fan creator dynamic that is created. That can be very pernicious and dehumanizing to both parties. So I'm quite hands off in the Discord. I sort of just let people get on with it in there. But people have like very fascinating discussions about politics and spirituality, and they share their art. They talk about all kinds of different things, and I go in there and I look and I get inspired by people, and there are people who have been there for a really long time since I started. So that's also available on Patreon. I also do a podcast called Low Society with my partner and two other YouTubers, Ashley and Peter Coffin, who are longtime friends and like colleagues of mine as well. And yeah, I do that bi-weekly. So every couple of days, there's like a new episode of Low Society to listen to. Yeah, because I don't make videos. I can't make videos as often anymore because they're so high production value at this point. So my fast food content, if you want to hear from me more frequently, is what I do over on Low Society, which is like really fun and good. And we often discuss like a lot of this social justice stuff there, but from the vantage point of like material analysis. So if that's something that interests you, you can definitely check Low Society out. But yeah, that's what I'm doing right now so far, and it's good. It's been hard for sure because of the fact that this sort of criticism can be met with hostility and bad faith. I mean, even if people disagree, that's one thing, but sometimes people sort of perceive it as being against social justice or wanting to do damage to social justice, which then makes them sort of act in very frightening and punitive ways in that regard. So I guess I'd like to round this out by stressing that I'm very much in favor of social justice, which is why I think that this critique is important, so that we can find better modes to enact it in society and not just take the ones that the market provides for us.
Absolutely, yeah. And I really don't know how, if somebody was 90 minutes into this, which is what it's come out as, to listen to the passion that you put into talking about class struggle and how, you know, how class issues affect Black people disproportionately. It's evident that you're not against social justice. It's evident, like, that clearly you do see that these problems are there and that they do matter, but you are questioning the modes that people are unwittingly moving into because they are not allowed almost to imagine that there's any other way of doing things. They are fed the way of doing things, and you know, though I may not feel that I agree with you on every point, it doesn't matter. It's I've never ever thought Angie's against social justice. Angie doesn't think that like Black people as a class have any issues. It's like that if anybody to come out the other side thinking that, I'd be like, pickle. Evidently that's quite wrong.
It's interesting. It's interesting though. I wish that was the case with a lot of people, but a lot of people seem to think that, like, you know, talking about class means that you're obfuscating the issues that affect certain communities disproportionately, which I think is dangerous because class isn't divorced from the problems that affect those groups. I don't see social justice as being separate from class issues. I feel like it's our current paradigm that separates the two, which is why we're having such trouble really making shifts in the way that we should be right now, because we see these two things as separate when they're really not. My struggle as a Black woman is a class struggle. It's part of class struggle. It seems as if people think that class politics are only for white people, or that's the only axis of oppression that white people can complain about. No, class politics are for everybody, and I'm not going to surrender something that is part of me. It's part of my trajectory. It's part of my legacy, just as much as it's part of yours. Especially if you come from a working class family, and you come from a poor family, or you're not somebody who's a member of the owning class. It's just as much yours as it is mine. It's all of us together. And that's the only way we're going to be able to solve anything, is if all of us together join around these sort of shared issues, which is where my ethos is at. But, you know, I guess for some people that's controversial, but, you know, it's the internet. That's how it works. That's how it works. But yeah, thank you for having me. I had such a great time talking to you. Sorry that I'm like ranting like a crazy person as well. Like, yeah.
No, I think we both got some lockdown energy actually. Like there's big lockdown vibes this time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like it.
I'm just like a person. I'm talking to another person.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, no, I've found that lockdown energy very lovely, and I really appreciate you for coming on and talking. And yeah, when you said that we should do that again sometime, I was like, yes, please.
Yeah.
That'd be amazing. So yeah,
anytime you want to talk to me, I'm available. And if you when you come back to the UK, let's go for drinks. When this whole zombie apocalypse situation blows over, let's go for drinks. Like if you don't want to come to London, I'll come to Kent. I'm always looking for excuses to get out of London anyway. So yeah, totally.
Let's do that. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me on the Deep Chats episode. And yeah, it's been awesome. Thanks, Angie.
Thank you.